I've spent 31 years working for the federal government, in a capacity I still can't fully explain to most people. And in all that time, through 3 overseas postings, 2 collapsed marriages that weren't really marriages, and more close calls than I care to count, the one thing that kept me moving forward was the thought of coming home to my mother. She used to make chicken and dumplings on Sunday afternoons. The smell of it would fill the whole house on Clearwater Lane, that little 2-story on the edge of Denton, Texas, with the pecan tree out front that my father planted the year I was born. She'd have the radio on low, some old country station, and she'd hum along to songs she half remembered. That image lived in the back of my mind like a photograph I carried in my wallet, worn at the edges, still clear in the middle. I retired at 62, 20 months ago now. After the debriefings and the paperwork and the quiet handshake in a government building that didn't have a name on the door, I drove to a Cracker Barrel outside of Knoxville, ordered a coffee I didn't finish, and sat there for about an hour just listening to people talk about ordinary things. Weather, football, a grandkids recital. I'd forgotten what that sounded like. Then I pointed my truck toward Texas. What I found when I got there wasn't chicken and dumplings. My mother, 79 years old, a woman who once drove herself to the emergency room with a broken wrist because she didn't want to bother anyone, was living in the back bedroom of a house that belonged to her, sleeping on a cot with a space heater she had to share with a storage rack full of my son-in-law's hunting equipment. Her name was still on the deed. Her Social Security check still went into her own account. But somehow, in the 4 years since my daughter and her husband had moved in to help her out, my mother had become a guest in her own home. I need to back up. I need to explain how something like this happens, because when I first started putting the pieces together, I kept thinking, how did I not see it? How does a man spend 3 decades reading people for a living and miss something happening right under his nose, 3 states away, to the one person he loved most in the world? The answer is that it happens slowly, and it happens through the people you trust. My daughter, I'll call her my daughter because that's what she still is, even now. Her name is Tamara. She's 41. She married a man named Boyd Sutter 9 years ago, and I will be honest, I never trusted Boyd, not because he did anything specific in those early years. Just a feeling, the kind of feeling you develop when your job requires you to assess people quickly and accurately. Boyd smiled too wide and talked too much about money he didn't have yet. He had plans, always plans. The plans changed every 18 months or so, but the confidence never did. When my mother started having some health issues, nothing catastrophic, just the ordinary erosion of being nearly 80, Tamara called me and suggested she and Boyd move in. Help with groceries, doctor's appointments, the yard. My mother's house was paid off. 3 bedrooms, a good-sized lot in a neighborhood that had quietly become valuable over the decades. My mother agreed because that's who she was. She didn't want to be a burden. She thought having family nearby was a blessing. I thought so too. I sent money every month, $2,000, into my mother's account to cover extra expenses. I called every Sunday. At first, the calls got shorter over time. My mother would say she was tired, that Tamara was right there and would take care of things, that I shouldn't worry. I told myself she was adjusting to having people in the house. I told myself I'd retire soon and visit more. I told myself a lot of things that made it easier to stay focused on work. That's the part I have to live with. When I arrived in Denton on a Tuesday in October, I hadn't announced I was coming. I'd learned over the years that announced arrivals tell you very little. I'd called my mother the week before and she'd sounded off. Not sad, exactly, more like careful. Like someone choosing each word. After 31 years of listening to people choose their words, I recognized it immediately. I just needed to see it for myself. I pulled up to the house at around 2 in the afternoon. The pecan tree was still there, though someone had trimmed it badly. There was a base boat parked in the driveway, a newer model, and I noticed a storage shed in the backyard that hadn't been there before. The kind of shed that runs about $4,000 if you buy it new. The front door was unlocked. I let myself in. The living room smelled like cigarette smoke and dog, and there were 2 dogs I'd never seen before. Big labs, friendly enough, but they'd done damage to the baseboards and the carpet near the front window. Boyd's hunting magazines were stacked on the coffee table my father built by hand in 1974. The kitchen was dishes in the sink and a half-empty case of Lone Star on the floor beside the refrigerator. I stood there for a moment. Then I heard the television from the back bedroom. Not the master, the smallest one, the one that used to be mine when I was a boy, and I walked down the hall and knocked. My mother opened the door. She'd lost weight, more than was healthy. Her eyes went wide when she saw me, and for just a second she looked, I don't have a better word for it, she looked terrified. Not of me, of what would happen next. "Harrison," she whispered, like she was saying a prayer. I held her for a long time. She was shaking, and I don't think it was from cold. I sat with her in that small room with the space heater and the hunting equipment, and I let her talk. It came out slowly at first, the way things do when someone has been keeping quiet for so long, that they're not sure what's safe to say. But I kept my voice steady and my face calm, habits that took decades to build, and in that moment I was grateful for every one of them. And gradually, the full picture emerged. Boyd had lost another job 8 months after moving in, third one in 4 years. Tamara was working part-time at a dental office, but most of what she made went to Boyd's truck payments and the boat and what he called business expenses for a pressure-washing venture that had never washed a single driveway. They'd stopped contributing to household expenses within the first year. They'd started pulling from my mother's account within the second. Small amounts at first, ATM withdrawals my mother didn't make, charges at sporting goods stores she'd never been to. When my mother noticed and asked about it, Boyd told her she was confused, that she must have forgotten. He said it kindly, the first few times, then less kindly. Tamara didn't stop him. I think she told herself it was temporary. I think she told herself a lot of things. By the time I arrived, my mother's checking account had been reduced to $412. Her savings, $53,000 she and my father had put away over 40 years of careful living, were gone. Boyd had had her sign paperwork she didn't fully understand, a power of attorney drafted by a notary he'd found on Craigslist, and then a transfer of funds he'd described as an investment account she'd share in. He'd moved the money in 3 separate transfers to avoid reporting thresholds. He thought he'd been clever. He hadn't been working with someone who spent 31 years watching people try to be clever. I didn't confront Boyd that day. I didn't confront Tamara either. I sat with my mother. I helped her eat something. There wasn't much in the house, so I drove to the H-E-B and bought groceries, enough to fill the refrigerator, and I stayed the night in the living room on the couch that smelled like those dogs. I lay awake most of the night thinking. The thing about being 62 and spending your career doing what I did is that you learn there are 2 ways to respond to something like this. There's the fast way, which feels good for about 15 minutes and then creates problems you spend years cleaning up. And there's the right way, which requires patience and documentation and letting the appropriate systems do what they're designed to do. I chose the right way, mostly. The next morning, I called a woman I'd worked with years ago. She'd left government service and gone into elder law in Dallas, one of the best in the state. Her name was Catherine, and I hadn't spoken to her in 6 years, but she picked up on the second ring, and when I explained the situation, she said, "Send me everything you have. Don't move any money yet, and get your mother out of that house." I also called a former colleague who now ran a private firm specializing in financial forensics. I won't use his name. He owed me something from a situation in Juarez in 2009 that we'd agreed never to discuss in detail. He started pulling records within the hour. Then I went back to the house and told my mother to pack what she needed for a week. She looked at me like I'd offered her water after a long drought. She packed a suitcase in about 8 minutes. I left a note on the kitchen counter. Not for Boyd, for Tamara. It said, "Call me today." I left my number, the number she hadn't used in almost a year. She called at 4 that afternoon. She was crying before I said a word, which told me she already knew. When someone cries before you've said anything, they already know. We talked for 2 hours. I didn't raise my voice. That's the part she kept mentioning later, that I didn't raise my voice. I told her what I knew, what I could prove, and what was going to happen next. I told her I loved her because it was true and it would always be true. I told her that Boyd had committed multiple felonies under Texas law, and that the documentation was already in the hands of people who knew exactly what to do with it. She asked me what she was supposed to do. I told her she had 2 choices. She could stand next to Boyd when this came apart, or she could cooperate with Catherine and give herself a fighting chance. I told her she had 24 hours to decide, and that whatever she decided, I would handle it. She showed up at the hotel where I was staying with my mother at 8 o'clock the next morning, without Boyd. What followed was about 11 weeks of the most painstaking legal and financial work I've ever been adjacent to, and I've been adjacent to some complicated situations. Catherine filed a petition to revoke the power of attorney on grounds of undue influence, and my mother's diminished capacity at the time of signing, supported by medical records we obtained from her doctor, who was, to put it mildly, not happy to learn how his patient had been living. The fraudulent transfers were documented in full. The notary who'd drawn up the paperwork lost his license and agreed to cooperate with investigators in exchange for leniency. Boyd hired a lawyer. The lawyer he could afford wasn't good enough. He was charged with financial exploitation of an elderly person, a first-degree felony in Texas when the amount exceeds $300,000, along with forgery and abuse of a disabled or elderly individual. He posted bail using money from a joint account Tamara hadn't known existed. That account was also flagged. He pled out eventually. 12 years, eligible for parole in 6. His attorney argued he was remorseful. Catherine argued the jury should see the photographs of my mother's living conditions, the space heater, the cot, the $412. The judge agreed with Catherine. The day of sentencing, I sat in the third row of the courtroom with my mother on one side and Tamara on the other. Tamara had cooperated fully. She'd given Catherine everything: account numbers, text messages, a recorded conversation she'd had the presence of mind to save from 8 months earlier, in which Boyd explicitly discussed moving money before the old man comes sniffing around. He'd meant me. He just hadn't known I was already coming. My mother didn't look at Boyd when they read the sentence. She looked straight ahead, and I watched her shoulders drop about an inch, like something she'd been holding for 4 years had finally been set down. We got most of the money back, not all of it. Some had been spent on things that couldn't be recovered: the boat, equipment, cash. But the bulk of it was seized through the financial forensics work and returned through civil proceedings. 41,000 of the 53. Catherine called it a good outcome. She said most families in similar situations recovered nothing. My mother is living with me now, in a house I rented in McKinney, while we figure out what to do long term. She has the larger bedroom. The kitchen is stocked. She's started making chicken and dumplings again on Sunday afternoons, and she has the radio on low, and she hums along to songs she half remembers. I sit at the kitchen table and drink my coffee, and I listen to her hum, and I think about all the Sundays I missed, and all the calls I kept short, and all the times I told myself she was fine, because it was easier than finding out she wasn't. There's something I want to say to anyone reading this who has an elderly parent or grandparent or anyone they love who is in the care of someone else. Pick up the phone, not to ask if everything is okay. People will say yes no matter what. Ask to speak to them alone. Listen to the way they pause. Listen to the words they choose carefully. Pay attention to what they don't say. And if something feels wrong, even if you can't name it, even if the people around them are telling you that you're overreacting, trust that feeling. Go see for yourself. I spent 31 years doing a job that required me to act on incomplete information and accept the consequences. The hardest call I ever made wasn't in a foreign country in a dangerous situation. It was recognizing that I had been willfully not looking at something I should have seen years earlier, and then deciding to look anyway. Tamara is getting help. We talk most weeks. It's not what it was, and I don't know if it ever will be. But she's my daughter, and she was afraid, and she made choices I don't fully understand, and I've had to make peace with holding two things at once: loving someone and knowing they let you down in a way that changed things permanently. Boyd Sutter is in the Caulfield unit in Tennessee Colony. He'll be there for a while. Last Sunday, my mother made her chicken and dumplings, and we ate at the kitchen table, and she told me about a dream she'd had, something about my father and a fishing trip they'd taken before I was born. She laughed while she told it, a real laugh, and the sound of it went all the way through me like light through a window. 62 years old, and I think that was the best afternoon of my life.